On today's show, we have Pip Davidson, who happens to be my publicist and is absolutely a phenomenal human overall. So Pip Davidson, they, has been working in marketing and publicity with traditional publishing houses for 7 years, specializing in social media and influencer strategy. He's worked previously at HarperCollins, at Penguin Random House, and currently works as a publicist and influencer strategist at Hay House. And in his spare time, he moonlights as a social media manager for his two cats, Nim and Gravy. Their socials are hilarious. We'll actually put them in the comments so that you can follow them if you want to see. So today we are going to be talking with Pip about belonging while gender expansive. And I think this is going to be a great episode for you to tune into, and I'm excited. Let's get into it. Pip Davidson in the house today, and I'm so excited. I had the great pleasure of meeting you about a year ago, Pip, and go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I can't believe it's been a year.
It's been
wild
a year.
To think about.
It's been right at a year. Here's what this looked like for me. I think I had just had some kind of procedure, like welcome to every other week of my life, right? I'm always having injections. And so for anyone who's not familiar, I have a physical disability. And so sometimes I'm in a wheelchair, always at least with a cane, sometimes with crutches. I'm cool with it, but it can be physically painful. And so I get I've had 8 hip surgeries. And so I'm either having a surgery or I'm having injections or I'm having someone twist and mold me into some kind of way. And so it was one of those times where I was like lying in bed. I'm really bad with that part of grammar, but I'm in bed and I'm bored, of course, because I'm on the go all the time. And I was like, ugh. So I pulled out my phone and some email popped up that there was a webinar from some kind of group that I was a part of. And there was a webinar with this like social media expert who was going to be on there. And I'm not big into like creating a social platform and all that stuff that a lot of professional folks do. And I was like, you know what? I could learn a few tricks or so. And so I hopped on there, and then there is this like glorious energy that pops through the screen. I was like, give me my computer. And I open it up, and here comes your energy through the screen. And it was like love at first sight. It's just like, I love this person. Like the way you were talking to all of us, all the questions that were coming through. I mean, people were basically like, what's social media? I mean, they were asking like almost the most basic of questions, and you had so much grace and you were so kind, and no one felt, like that they should have known this better than someone else. We all just were fine with not knowing things. And your grace and kindness, and then on top of it, like your vast amount of knowledge was incredible. And so at the end, I there are a few hundred people in there, and I pop in the chat and I was like, so how does someone book a one-on-one with you? And you're like, thank you for that segue. And I'm like,
I forgot you were of course you were the one to ask that. I remember that someone did, and looking back, I'm like, of course it would have been you.
Oh my gosh. But I was like, oh my goodness. Thank you for acknowledging me. I felt so important.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I was equally same. As soon as we had that first call together, it was just like, yeah, you're one of my favorite people to talk to in general.
I was just truly so humbled by how helpful you were. And let's be honest, this podcast probably would not exist had it not been for the support that I got from you. So Pip Davidson, everyone, round of applause. Because really, I was like, okay, I'll just try these little short videos on this other platform. And I'm like, I'm just too long-winded to just talk for a minute. I can't get it all in 15, 20 seconds, or not even a minute. I tried a 3-minute. I was like, I can't do it. And you're like, maybe we need some more long form.
Yeah, which is wild because I truly do not tell people to start with podcasts most of the time. You are the exception to the rule. Usually I tell people to start with social media and see how it goes. But you are just so dedicated to immediately being like, I'm gonna do this and I'm gonna do it right. And I was like,
Oh.
okay, yeah, this is the rare person who I truly believe can get a podcast off the ground. And now look at it. Everything's going
Oh,
so good.
but honestly, it's so much because of your support, and I think one of the places that we really connected right away was on this topic that I talk about incessantly, which is belonging. And you and I have different identities, and some similar ones, but several different ones, and it didn't even matter because we understood the language of belonging right away. And so from that, I think grew this, what I'm going to venture to say is a friendship, that I'm
Absolutely.
so
Yes.
honored to call you a friend. And so if we
Uh,
if we delve into it, um, so that I don't just like bore you to pieces, Pip, with how much I adore you.
as if you have ever bored me ever.
But if we delve into it a little bit, we'll just start out with how you do identify.
Yeah, I mean, it is such an interesting question, and I kind of have two answers. In general, right now, to the wider public, I identify as a trans man, which has been absolutely a journey. And when we first met, I think I was just using they, them pronouns.
Yeah.
It took me a little bit to more publicly, especially professionally, it's very interesting
Mm.
making that shift. But you'll see, I still use he, they pronouns. I still keep the they in there kind of as a general nod. And I think sometimes cis people have a harder time fully understanding that and why we decided to lean on the phrase gender expansive as
Mhm.
opposed to even just trans or trans mask, because there's always going to be a part of me that still feels more expansive than just trans mask. That's where I am headed and where I feel most in my
Mhm.
own belonging. But truthfully, I still don't feel like I sit in a binary. I still always, anytime it's safe, want people to know I'm trans because I'm very
Mhm.
proud of being trans. I'm not interested in trying to become or pass as a cis man. That's not really my ultimate goal. So in the kind of the short version, I identify as a trans man, but in the more nuanced version, I identify somewhere on the spectrum, leaning more masculine.
And it also, I think gender expansiveness means something different to different people. So for
Hmm.
you specifically, what does gender expansive mean?
For me, I feel like gender expansiveness uh, has a lot to do, honestly, with introspection. It has to do with sitting with yourself and trying to decide whether you end up, landing more on the binary spectrum, or you feel fully cis, or you feel, more binary trans. There's a certain amount of just having that conversation with yourself about what gender means. Because gender very much, I will, it's become an almost overused phrase, but gender is a construct. It is something we have all decided, and we've decided the different ways to perform. And that's changed throughout history. Men used to wear heels, and that was very common. Pink used to be the color of men before they decided to, because it was like more red and like supposed to be more masculine. So how we decide, even through history, of performing gender is very cultural, and there's always cultural shifts. So I feel like being gender expansive is just sitting in yourself to decide for yourself, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a man or a woman or anything in between for you personally?
Mhm.
And that can often mean a whole lot of different things. Gender isn't just how we dress. I often say, and I do believe this is true, the more I transition medically with testosterone, if I start growing a full beard, I'm going to start wearing makeup and jewelry again. There's a certain amount
Mm.
where I like the idea of expressing gender in a more complicated way than just what's kind of expected.
And it's interesting that you're using the word introspection too,
Hmm.
because it reminds me of how we have different parts of self. And at any given moment, we are either consciously or subconsciously, or on some level, making a decision of what part of self or what parts of different parts of ourselves are coming for. And that's in just our way that we move through life in general,
Yeah.
regardless of gender identity. And so when you say that it's about introspection, it makes me think of how you get to have agency and you get to have a decision of which
Mhm.
parts of your gender identities, plural, are going to come forward in a given moment, whether it's coming forward internally as far as like how you're experiencing self or how
Mhm.
you're expressing yourself, because gender expression is a whole different thing, right?
Totally. Like I identify as trans masc, but I do still feel a certain amount of non-binary identity or a certain amount of androgyny. The question comes up of why would you medically transition? Or why,
Mhm.
if you are still feeling or you don't believe gender is real, then why do you want to be called a man? And I think ultimately the answer to that, if you boil it down to its most base, is it makes me happy. you know, I think regardless of, like there's that question often from the conservative side of is being trans a choice, and often
Mhm.
I like to approach that side of that conversation again with the amount of being introspective. There is a certain amount where I like to sit and question myself, and even if I do question myself of maybe let's say this is entirely a choice, that it wasn't something that is born within me. um does it matter? And I don't think it does. I think what I'm doing right now makes me so happy. Identifying as a man makes me happier than I've ever been in my life. I feel more belonging in myself than I've ever felt in my life. So yeah, like I sometimes I find that conversation funny. This idea of how do you know for sure? All I know for sure is that I'm really happy right now and I am thriving more than I ever have in my life, and that's all that really matters to me.
And it makes me happy gets to be good enough.
Yeah,
Like that
exactly.
gets to
Yeah.
be good enough. There doesn't have
Yeah.
to be this like explanation to other people. And it's really part of that self
Right.
belonging too, of this is
Hmm.
how I'm celebrating myself.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that idea that we don't need to, yeah, find all of the answers to everything in order to get ourselves to belong. And also with that idea of it's kind of a mix of self-belonging and community kind of based belonging. There's a lot of imposter syndrome that happens when you're trans. I remember early on when I was figuring out and coming to terms more, because this has been a well more than decade long process of me even trying to find the vocabulary. And I remember I was talking to one of my trans friends who was a clutch for me in my coming out. And I was telling her, what if what if I am just an imposter? What if this is anxiety? Or what if it's just that I don't want to be a woman because being a woman is hard? And going through all these questions. And she listened very quietly and then paused after I stopped talking. And she said, uh, Pip, no one who is cis thinks about gender this much.
I have so many clients who have partners who have narcissistic traits. Okay. So I'll send
Hmm.
them to a certain YouTube channel of a phenomenal clinical psychologist and they'll watch all these videos to learn about like the signs of narcissistic personality disorder or the signs of narcissistic
Hmm.
abuse. And then inevitably they come back and they go, I wonder after watching so many of these, I started wondering, do you think I'm a narcissist? And I go, said no narcissist ever.
Yeah, exactly. No, yeah, it is so similar. It was like, yeah, cis people don't spend this long worrying
Right.
about whether or not they're cis. It's
Right.
just like, yeah,
Right.
yeah, it's just our brains kind of deciding to lie to us. So
Yeah.
so yeah, there is that kind of sense of imposter syndrome that comes along. And I can't remember exactly what you said that put us on this topic. But I because there is something also tying to the idea of community belonging, and
Yeah.
there's like a certain amount of questioning too if you are enough to be part, and especially in the queer community, I think this question of am I queer enough? Am I gay enough? Am I trans enough in order to also be part of this community? I remember I had a friend in the Bay Area, and he is fully bisexual and polyamorous, and but mostly dates in what other people would consider to be hetero relationships, from the outside. Like he would mostly be dating women. And we were hanging out, and I just made some kind of joke and referred to both of us as queer. And later that night, he texted me and he was like, "No one's ever called me queer before in a way that made me feel like I am being included." He was like, "Because I date
Wow.
women, even though I am bi, I don't often feel like I'm allowed to have that." And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, my heart just broke because I've also been there before
Yeah.
too. There was a period of time that I felt like, am I allowed to, be in pride parades? Like, am I really allowed to have this
Mm.
space before I was fully out when I knew, but I wasn't really outwardly presenting or outwardly dating in a queer way. Yeah, this idea of am I enough in order to belong to this community, or am I stealing
Yeah.
space somehow? And
And
that's
what does
always just
queer
been such an
enough look
interesting
like?
thing.
What does
Yeah,
queer
well,
enough look like,
exactly.
Pip? Look, I
Yeah.
just had a conversation in another episode with one of my best friends who's bisexual. And
Mhm,
she said, she's 50 years old. She said that she has struggled with this idea of I'm not gay enough or I'm not queer enough until more
mhm.
recently, and has never been to a pride parade because felt like she would almost be like appropriating, you know what I mean? Like if she went and like,
God,
here
I've
you go,
heard
it
that
is an
so many
ally.
times from
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
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 And so she said that there's a gay man, a gay cis man, who said to her, she was sharing this with him, and he said to her, "Well, you belong with me." And that was the first time at 50 years old that she started to feel like, "Oh, wait, I am part of the queer community." It was like a gate for her, like
Mhm.
he ushered her in just by way of saying that. And so it begs the question, what does queer enough actually look like? What does that mean? And I think there is a
Yeah.
specific look that I believe is rooted in racism.
Yeah, it depends on the community you come across. My personal community is very open to anyone who identifies the least bit will basically just be like, you are queer. Like basically, as far as we're concerned. And there's also too, and I think about it like on a very consistent basis. I don't have it pulled up in front of me, so it's going to be paraphrasing, but the bell hooks quote about queerness not just being in who you date, but queerness as in living on the fringes. Queerness as
Mhm.
choosing to live outside of what is deemed this is what society says is the norm. Breaking free of that. Like I would say people, even if they consider themselves fully heterosexual but are dating polyamorously, that is
Mhm.
queer. Like people breaking relationship structures. But that said, there is absolutely, and it is particularly among white queer people, and especially among white cis queer people, but honestly, I see it among a lot of white trans people too. Um, of a certain gatekeeping of what
Mhm.
queerness not even just is, but just what it looks like. Because there
Mhm.
are a lot of especially white queer people who have their ideology on paper, but then the way it plays out in real life is different. And
Yeah.
often what that is what does a non-binary person look like? And most
Uh-huh.
of the time, people picture a non-binary person, and it is a thin, androgynous white person, and that is what non-binary
Right.
looks like. And so I've seen a lot, and I've come across definitely people talking on social media and in real life too. Fat black bodies aren't allowed to be seen as non-binary in that
Mhm.
kind of, not to say that obviously on an individual level, but in kind of the wider view, people have a harder time accepting, especially people of color, as fitting in that kind of androgynous non-binary space,
Yeah.
in a way that's really fascinating and often uncomfortable to be in places where those comments and conversations are happening, because there is absolutely a certain amount where there are queer white people who think they're exempt because they're also marginalized. And so there's absolutely a racism issue within queer communities because there's a certain amount of being like, well, I'm queer, so I get it. And they're two very
Yeah.
different things, like
And
very
and
different
also
experiences.
and a white patriarchal issue. So the same thing that we see in straight hierarchy, like in straight social hierarchy, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of white, straight, cis men, right? Are like at the top, because of course there has to be a hierarchy, there has to be a top and
Of
there has to be a
course.
bottom. And then there's like all the little structures that go down from there. But at the very,
Mm-hmm.
very top is the white, straight, cis man, and they're more privileged identities, able bodied. There's a lot more that goes with that. But we'll talk about in general terms, it's the white, straight, cis man.
Mm-hmm.
Then you go to the queer community, or in this social structure, it's the white,
Mm-hmm.
gay, cis man that's at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like the face of the queer community for so many people in their minds.
Right. The people that are the most palatable or closest to privilege are the first ones that are fully accepted. So like now
Right.
everyone loves the gays, but now the
Mhm.
transgender people, those are the people to worry about.
Mhm.
It's this past week I had a really emotional day because and I don't even want to bring her name up in this, but a very prolific author of fantasy children's books who has now become
Mhm.
like her whole goal now is to hate trans people.
Mhm.
And it's very interesting anytime seeing her supporters pop up. And I mean, and this goes for any anti-trans or transphobic people. The rhetoric they use is so similar to the rhetoric that was being used for gay men, and also lesbian women too. But
Yeah, copy
like the
paste.
idea of that it's like these people are groomers, and they're going to like uh uh, bring like debauchery to our children and they're unsafe and all of this. And now that same rhetoric is being used for trans people, but the people who are using it are in the same breath saying, but I love gay people. It's just trans people that I don't like. And there's something so
Mhm.
fascinating in seeing that and seeing it be weaponized and seeing the attempt to split the community in order to say, like, no, we love the gays and the lesbians, and even sometimes bisexuals, if we, for those people that admit that they exist. But trans people,
Right.
like, that's the new enemy. Um, and also too within the hierarchy, very important to acknowledge at all times, um, that trans women and trans femme people, and especially trans women of color, have a much more difficult time and are much more targeted than any other trans people. That's just
Yeah.
statistically true. And even when you
Yeah.
see it with that particular author, um, she's somebody who sees me as a gender traitor for sure. But I think trans men are often seen by these TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, as, misguided women. And, like this idea of like, oh, well, you're just a woman who lost her way because you didn't like how hard it is to be a woman.
Mm.
Um, but they see trans women as predators, and it's this like interesting gender essentialist take when it comes down to it, that kind of circles on the way back around to misogyny. Uh, this idea that if you are born in a body that was assigned male at birth, you are inherently a predator. And if you are born
Yeah.
in a body that was assigned female at birth, you are inherently a victim or inherently weaker in some way. And so you still see the attempt of that hierarchy being put in place, I think, by a lot
Mhm.
of TERFs who are trying to make sense of, well, how does this fit in our structure of how we have understood what safety means for us? And I think a lot of people are trying to find belonging also with that too through safety. And there is a certain amount that I totally understand that, you know, understanding trans people and the transgender experience can be really confusing for a lot of other people. Um, and I think the wrong way to go about fixing that confusion isn't to try to figure out how do we fit this back into that patriarchal hierarchy, where because that ultimately, being gender expansive is breaking that, so you can't fit back
Yeah.
into it.
It's interesting
Yeah.
too, the how ironic that the narrative is that trans women are predators when trans women are most at risk of having violence upon them,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
of being attacked,
Absolutely.
of being killed, being
Mm-hmm.
murdered, of
Mm-hmm.
being injured. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's one of the great ironies of a very false narrative.
Yeah. It is so true, so statistically proven that
Mhm.
trans women of color, especially, are the
Mhm.
most at risk group for multiple things right now, and especially hate crimes and violence. So seeing the narrative twist in pop and or not pop culture necessarily, but the loud conservative right on online, especially, yeah, it's painful. And that's also too, when it comes to belonging in community, um, I feel so much belonging and connection to other trans people who just exist. Like there's if I could come across another person, there's a certain amount too. It's not always, but there's a certain vibe you can get on the street, even passing somebody, where it's like, I see you, you see me, we know each other's deal. And
Yeah.
even if we never talk, there's that moment of connection.
Yeah.
And so and I think sometimes too, in that kind of continued narrative of trying to cause a rift within the queer community and the trans community, I think sometimes there is also an attempt to create a rift between trans masc and trans femme people.
Mhm.
And it is so important for us to see each other's experiences as uh, more similar than different. I definitely have leaned into that thought process now of considering trans people my siblings. Like it feels like an extended family. When Trans Day of Visibility comes around and Trans Day of Mourning comes around, there is that feeling of it, and it's not the same. I definitely want to make sure to stress that it is a different kind of trauma, but there is a kind of generational trauma that I feel like ripple through, especially because and in my generation, like we don't have trans elders. So many
Mm.
of our, trans like the older generation, the Gen X and Boomer generation, didn't make it through the AIDS crisis, like so there is a certain amount of feeling loss for having a kind of mentor generation just wasn't there. I think that's also why we're seeing this, or what's perceived as a boom of trans people. And really, it's just, the internet allows us all to be in more communication with each other. I believe, looking back, I have had this in me the whole time, but I didn't have language for it until I was in my mid to late 20s. And that's when I
Mm.
uh, started to understand a little bit more. Um, yeah, I feel like I'm trailing in a different direction now,
Yeah. No,
but
I'm
yeah.
following, I'm tracking all that because what I'm hearing, Pip, too, is just from like a universal belonging standpoint. This is
Hmm.
new territory for
Hmm.
much of the trans community in general. When you're talking about not having people before you lead the way, in
Hmm.
terms of like what this looks like, or even having shoulders to stand on. You are those shoulders that future generations will be standing on.
Yeah, exactly. And and it is so wonderful seeing so many people coming out late in life, and
Mhm.
embracing that. And still, there is I would say most of my trans friends didn't come out until their late 20s, early 30s at this point. Like
Yeah.
and a lot of that, yeah, is that we're able to find more, um be more connected despite space, being able to be
Yeah.
connected
Yeah.
online.
And that's not to discount the people that have come before you, but in terms of having like a large
Hmm.
community of people that
Hmm.
you could look to almost as for guidance or inspiration, it's not there.
Yeah,
So it's there's like
exactly.
the few persons here and there that you can say, oh, they made it. They
Hmm.
made it through. But
Yeah,
in
yeah,
general, the messaging has been, we're not safe.
absolutely. And there was I came across this TikTok that was super powerful, and I can't remember the username. If I find it again, I will send it to you. But it was a trans person. I think they were in their at least 50s, they might have been in their 60s, and they were just making videos, and they were seeing an influx of comments from younger trans people saying like, "Oh my God, I feel so emotional right now. I've never seen a trans person with wrinkles." Or like I
Oh,
like this isn't something
wow.
that I've yeah, like I didn't know we get to live that long. There's like
Oh my
that kind of
gosh.
narrative that can yeah definitely sit heavy, and it's different from intergenerational trauma from a BIPOC perspective, absolutely, but there is kind of an interesting um yeah, like line of history and being tapped into that history. And honestly, too, it's gonna sound a little bit corny, but it is very true. I give myself testosterone shots weekly, and I've always had a fear of needles. Like I never thought I'd be able to give myself a shot. Now I do it on a weekly basis. I've done it 60, 70 times or something. Um, and often, if I'm having a hard time, just getting over the mental block of giving myself a shot, I do take a moment to sit and think about everyone that came before me and everyone who has the potential to come after me. And there's a certain, yeah, almost like spiritual moment that I have with myself of thinking, I am doing this not just for me, but for everybody who wanted to and never got a chance. And like that
Mm,
feels really powerful and connecting. And we've talked about this too, on a just personal level. Being white in America is weird culturally. We talked about, when it comes to belonging, white people have a hard time belonging culturally because like often we've lost that, or like yeah, like we're raised more individualist, or even, even if it's like I'm a quarter Irish, that's still not really something I was raised with.
culturally
Um
with, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So the shift of ever since, fully embracing coming out, not just as queer, but as trans, and, finding my people, having that shift to having that kind of deeper cultural connection, has
Mhm.
been really powerful and not something that I was necessarily expecting. Um, but yeah, that
Yeah.
I feel like that was the first time I got a taste of what it's like to have the generations before leading to who you are and how that can affect who you are today.
Mhm.
Yeah. So just fascinating.
Yeah, it is interesting as and we have talked about it, and so many people might be like, "What?" When we say that in general, and we're not talking about individuals, okay, we know everyone has their own stories. In
Yeah.
general, though, white society in the United States is quite individualistic. It's like each for your
Hmm.
own, right? And people it doesn't
Hmm.
mean that people don't have strong family ties or strong family connections, but there is this sense of um, almost like infighting and competition,
Oh,
even
absolutely.
within their own communities, right? I remember I
Mm.
had a kid in 5th grade. We were in the carpool line, and my kid says, "Mom, my white friends are different than my brown friends." And I said, "Really?" I said, in what ways?" And they said, "It's really strange, Mom. My white friends, they're really nice." And my kids are biracial, by the way. Yeah, they're
Hmm.
Egyptian and white. And so my kid says, "My white friends my white friends are competing with each other, with their own friends." And he's like, "I don't understand it. Why are they competing with their own friends?" I was like, "Hmm."
So
I didn't wanna say anything. I
interesting.
wanted to say I was like, "And what's different about that from your brown friends?" And he's like, "Well, my brown friends just help each other out, like, so
Yeah.
that everybody gets what they want." And I said, "Yeah? So that's different?" He's like, "Yeah, my white friends are, like, all competing for the same thing instead of, like, figuring out what
Hmm.
everybody wants and, like, and helping each other get it." And I was like, "Interesting
Yeah.
observation."
No,
You know?
totally. And thinking back, that definitely was, I did definitely have experiences of that growing up. And yeah, I think it comes down to, do you have something that can make you feel deeply connected to somebody across the globe from you? Like
Right,
that, like, do you have that
right.
experience of feeling like you have an understanding that the person standing next to you may not get, but somebody who is thousands of miles away will understand you instantly. And
Yeah.
I think having that changes your experience of understanding what the power that community can give you. And yeah,
Yeah.
just knowing that you have the power of even just shorthand of, you know, of I because it's funny, I was actually talking with one of my friends, kind of going back to how you identify, that kind of question.
Hmm.
And be big like, yeah, it depends on who's asking me. You know, like there's the,
So
if I
true.
know somebody, you know, is more on the early levels of understanding queer language, then I'll just say identifies trans man, you know. But
Hmm.
if it's somebody who I know is entrenched and is somebody who is just super queer and super trans, then well, oftentimes it'll then end up coming out just as a joke. One of my friends, I love this joke, and I'm, yeah, just shamelessly stealing it from him. He says that he is he, him in the same way that boats are she, her. So it's like, you know, like vaguely. So
Loosely.
like often, yeah, loosely, you know, like, because often that tends to be how it devolves. And so it's so funny seeing, you know, when I have conversations about being trans with cis people, it tends to be, you know, pretty serious and pretty, you know, like trying to get in the weeds and trying to get them to understand the weight that comes behind these identities. But if I'm in a room of trans people, we're just making a lot of jokes usually. It's like it becomes so much less serious because once you start to get
Right.
in the weeds of what gender really is for you just realize how silly it is. It's all
It
just
is.
so like
It really can
unserious.
be. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's like that's such a great visual too, in terms of like moving from one
Mhm.
community to the other. Like this is very serious and almost like academic, right? And then over here
Yeah.
it's like,
Well, I
okay,
mean,
we can let loose and laugh
I'm
about it.
sure you get that too. You know, I know that happens. It's just it's code switching and whatever
It
you know, whatever
is, yeah.
community that you're going from. You know, when you, yeah, when you're in a room of people who you know fully understand you or have that, you
Yeah.
know, similar experience, yeah, you can strip off some of, because you know, it takes off the weight of, I have to be representing something right now to
Oh, that's
like
so
this
true.
person,
Yeah.
you know, which I know you've experienced.
Well,
Yeah.
yes, it's we have, like I said in the beginning, we have very different identities. But when I'm with my big fat
Mhm.
Egyptian family, yeah, I mean, we're talking in accents like our parents. I mean, things we would never
Yeah.
do publicly because it seems so disrespectful. But like our parents think it's
Yes.
funny too. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
when we're making fun
exactly.
of them, and yeah, and
Yeah, you
making
know,
fun of
it
our own
is
culture. It's really fun. Or making fun of the
absolutely.
things that like for your case, maybe the shit that cisgender folks ask. For us, it's the things
Mhm,
that like other, folks who aren't Egyptian or who aren't Middle Eastern ask, like, did you grow
mhm.
up, riding camels? Do they have cars in Egypt? I'm like, I grew up in the home of the KKK in the rural Southern North Carolina, or, and
Yeah,
they're it's
yeah.
like, do they have cars in Egypt? Did your parents grow up in a pyramid? Shit like that. And so
Mhm,
when we're when I'm with my people, we can laugh about that
mhm.
stuff. You know what I mean? And it's
Exactly,
much
and
more
you can, like,
lighthearted.
make those same jokes or same similar types of jokes, and it's funny when you understand the depth of it. You know, like, my friends and I use words that cis people are not allowed to call us, you know, but we use them among each other because it's like a, you know, it's yeah, it becomes part of the code switching of what people are comfortable with, and also kind of that sense too of and I mean, yeah, just speaking from the queer community side, what other people would see as debaucherous. You know, jokes that other
Mm,
people would like, even talking about sex and sexuality. You know,
mhm.
things that people see as very taboo. And are like treated with a lot of, yeah, like weight when you're among the, what I say lovingly, normies. And is just kind of goes out the window when you're with your people, and then you can just, yeah, you can talk completely mask off, and it's just, so there is something
Yeah.
really funny with that too, when I see, you know, like discourse about gender online, and it can be so fraught and so like so full of emotional turmoil. And I think that there are a lot of cis people that do see, you know, like and like, how do I want to phrase this so that it makes the most sense? Um like, there's the prevailing idea that if you misgender somebody, they're going to scream and cry at you and say that you're the worst person in the world. And that's
Hmm.
kind of a narrative built up by conservative people. And that's not to say that people aren't allowed to have an emotional reaction if they're misgendered. Um, uh, you don't know how many times it's happened that day. It's possible
Right.
that it's one of those things where somebody just has reached their limit and they're like, I'm having an emotional reaction right now. But for the vast majority of people that I know who are trans, it's way less serious than that. It's more just like a, okay, you slipped up, that's fine, correct yourself, move on. Like we don't want to like linger on this.
Yeah.
It isn't this idea that you're gonna somehow undo my identity by using a different pronoun than the one that, I prefer, the one that feels most right to me.
But then it becomes like a side conversation, like, "Oh, I'm sorry." Like, I did this in the past a couple years back, and I looked back later and I was like, and the person was like, "It's so much more than that. It's not, that's fine." I'm like, "You know what? That conversation was about me." Like, I was thinking it was about being respectful to the other person, and it was, but the carrying
Hmm.
on part of it was about me, you know? And that's
Yeah.
one of the things I've had to name and own.
Well, and I've experienced that as a white person from the other perspective of like, how do you handle when you've messed up and you've hurt somebody, uh, like feeding into racism in a way that you weren't necessarily even trying to do, but it happened. And yeah, at what
Yeah.
point do you just let go of, okay, I just need to learn from this and move on, as opposed to, please absolve me of this.
Yeah.
There's that kind of
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like that can happen a lot in conversation. Um, but yeah, it's just very interesting seeing the uh kind of dichotomy between what I think the wider, especially conservative world thinks of trans people and how we react to things. And again, we're not a monolith. A lot of this has been just me speaking based on obviously my own experience. Yeah, like for the most part, things aren't like don't feel that serious. As long as I feel like somebody is trying to respect me, I don't care. Like I've
Yeah.
misgendered myself. Like it happens. Like, it's I spent 30 years using a set of pronouns for myself. And like even though now I know my own truth, it doesn't mean that I can just immediately turn my programmed brain off.
Yeah.
Sometimes the slip just happens. So it really has more to do with, yeah, are we in a space where I feel like you respect me, you're doing your best to see me, you're doing your best, like if as long as that's there, yeah, pronoun slip ups happen and then you
Yeah.
just move on. It's fine.
When you're talking, Pip, about 30 years using a set of pronouns, what
Mhm.
what was your gender expansive journey like for you?
Like the first time that I remember kind of dipping my toe in was I was in college, and I had learned of the term demigirl, which demis often put in front of both like gender and also sexuality to kind of mean gray area. So people who are identifying as demigirls, it's like mostly girl, but maybe not really. And I remember coming across that phrase or that word and thinking, "Oh my God, that's an option!" like having that be like I didn't even know that was a
Yeah.
thing that I could potentially have. And pretty much from then, and I was probably 19, 20, I carried that even though I didn't talk to people about it much. I remember I brought it up to my mom once. But that's how I referred to myself anytime I was journaling, how I was, it felt, I already knew there was just something different that I hadn't fully tapped into, knowing that I wasn't fully a girl. A lot of this was also tied into my understanding of my sexuality. I feel like I knew pretty early on, looking back, that I am bisexual, but it took a lot longer for me to actually like come out and embrace that, and was kind of similar journey that happened more quickly, but that was also because the language around sexuality was already so mainstream. It was a lot easier for me to be able to communicate that to other people and to myself. Um, and then it was kind of going through my 20s. I was in a relationship for almost 4 years, and I remember specifically in that relationship, which is very funny, he's with a non-binary person now, which I think is great. It does something gender euphoria for me knowing that he ended up with somebody who wasn't cis. Um,
Yeah.
Being with him felt very, I remember just thinking, I belong in this body removed from labels. Anytime that I was interacting with him, I didn't necessarily feel like he was trying to make me feel like a woman, or I just felt like I was existing in that space. And we never really talked about that, but that's very much how I felt. And then it was honestly, and I had a few friends on kind of gender expansive journeys in my late 20s. Um, it was something that I was having a lot of conversations about, and something where particularly two of my friends, one of them being the one who told me that if I'm thinking about it this much, that maybe I'm not an imposter and maybe it's something I do want to explore.
Mhm.
She was also kind of mid her transition story, and then the pandemic hit. And
Mm.
there is a trend to the point where it's become a kind of like underlying joke, or kind of just mainstream joke, honestly, at this point in queer community, that so many people came out trans after the pandemic. And I know, at least from my experience, I can speak more to that. But it's gotten to it was to the point where I think it's a friend of a friend designed a t-shirt that said, I went through the 2020 quarantine and all I got was this lousy t-shirt, and also I'm trans now. Because it was just such a common
Yeah.
experience. And from my personal experience, because that is really when it broke open for me, having that experience of going from presenting in a casual, like business casual wear every day, of being observed every day and feeling like I needed to perform a certain type of gender. In my office, women were always wearing like flowy sundresses and stuff. And I was like, okay, well, to fit
Mhm.
in, I feel like I need to present my gender a certain way. Being removed from that and all of a sudden being in a place where I could wear whatever I want inside. People started dressing way more casually at home when everyone started working from home. I didn't feel
Mhm.
like I needed to be putting on makeup. I started shaving my head, which was something that I actually started a few months before the pandemic, just because I always really liked having short hair. And then that became very convenient during the pandemic that I learned to shave my own head. But there was something in that
Yeah.
as well, of just like fully embracing, leaning a little bit more into androgyny, and just the even going out and being masked. And if I went out and was masked and wore baggy clothes, it was like no one can perceive me. I can only it gave me the opportunity to be in a vacuum where it was pretty much just me perceiving myself. And that allowed me to really sit and understand how I want to perceive myself. So that it was really the pandemic that really cracked it open. And I think that is true for a lot of trans people in that same way. When you're removed from feeling like you have to present gender in the way you were taught to present gender, and instead just get to be in your body however you want to be in your body, it can lead to some really important breakthroughs. So that's really what it was for me. Yeah.
Because you're removed from community, that community
Hmm.
belonging that we've talked about, where so many people experienced isolation because they leaned so heavily on community. It was actually
Hmm.
an opportunity for you to not have to lean heavily on community anymore and not have to have that community
Yeah.
belonging, so that you had
Hmm.
space to really explore who you are. And that's like that layer of being seen, of seeing yourself and that self belonging. But then also
Yeah.
the universal belonging part of it is we're all
Hmm.
kind of having this pressing collective universal experience of the pandemic. And so that takes on a new role in terms of, it's not about do I belong in this world anymore, because kind of front and center was everyone's in this same kind of boat together right now, and there's not as much focus particularly on how you're showing up in that
Hmm.
space universally. And so now it's like, okay, well, I have me, myself. Who am I really? Like, I have a lot more time to look in the mirror. Like, what do I see? The proverbial mirror. So that makes a lot of sense to me that you had that space to reclaim that have that length of time to also embrace and accept that aspect of your identity. And then over time, learn how you're going to celebrate that, whether that's, okay, I'm going to dress a little bit differently. And then, I'm going to start speaking to it more, differently in terms of how I identify who I am openly. And so it just sounds like there was more room to breathe and actual more space too, in terms of like your identity in that way. So
yeah. And it's funny, I never really thought about it, but you're so right about that idea of, the necessity of removing myself from the community belonging, of considering community being like the workplace, and community being the um not standard world, but like the world as was expected of me, like being in that particular space. So that it is really interesting to think about it as going from, needing a break from that community, because that wasn't my core community, it turned out. The more I was able to kind of do a reset and then find my people, is what really, allowed me to sit most in my sense of self-belonging and in community belonging. So there is something interesting in that particular conversation of, you can't find community belonging if you're not in the right community. It's just going to feel isolating.
you got to have that there has to be that space between. And the greatest irony about belonging, the belonging journey, is that it's going to have periods of loneliness. That's just the greatest irony of it. And those lonely periods are when we can create space for other people and other types of energy to come in and breathe. So with that, I want to ask you the last question. My favorite one to ask folks is, what does belonging mean to you?
It's so funny and surreal to be asked this question, because I remember when we were brainstorming about this podcast and we came up with that question as the question. And it's funny too, because even though I was part of that structuring, and even though I knew I was going into this, it didn't hit me until this afternoon that I was like, oh, right, I need to answer that question. Like that's the one that is for sure going to be asked. So that's very funny and surreal. But so when I was thinking and kind of sitting and trying to figure out what that was, it sounds corny, but the thing that I keep coming back to is I feel like belonging is coming from a place, or to really, how do I want to say this? Belonging to me feels like love. It feels like compassion. Like maybe even compassion is a better word than love. Being able to have compassion for yourself, but there's a certain amount of me finding belonging within myself and belonging in my identity. So much of it was allowing people to love me, like to love me and see me in a way that I kept a barrier up for a very long time. And so now when I think about belonging, I just really think about being held in love, love for myself, love for my community, and also receiving love. So I think belonging has to do a lot with, that kind of exchange of love and compassion for each other and meeting people where they are.
You know what else I hear in that too, Pip, is belonging is vulnerability.
Yeah, that is kind of, that's the word. That's the thing I was trying to get to. Belonging kind of is vulnerability. In order to really allow yourself to be held, allow yourself to say, am I enough to be in this community? That is deeply vulnerable. So I think that's it.
So beautiful. So beautiful. I love you, Pip. I appreciate you.
Oh my God, Mona, I love you so much.
I see you and I embrace you and I celebrate you openly, because you're just the best, best, best. And I appreciate your being here. And you're just all the things. And thank you.
Thank you for having me on. It is, it's very surreal. And I just feel so honored that you wanted to have me on as a guest.
Thank you, Pip. Much love.